Hello, I'm Dave Allman-Smith, and I'm honored to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Edzard Ernst is a scholar of alternative medicine as well as a skilled science communicator. Dr. Ernst led the University of Exeter's complementary medicine department from 1993 to 2012. He founded 3 medical journals. He has published over 1,000 papers in peer-reviewed journals. His books have been translated into over a dozen languages. He has received many prestigious awards and is a fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, CSI. During the last 25 years, Professor Ernst's research has focused on critically evaluating so-called alternative medicine. This does not endear him to the many believers in alternative medicine. Es freut mich sehr, Herrn Dr. Edzard Ernst vorzustellen. Dr. Ernst?
Hello. Nice to be here.
I'm glad. Yes, thank you. I understand that both your father and grandfather were doctors. I'm curious, what were their specialties?
My grandfather was a generalist and my father was a diabetologist.
What was that last?
Diabetologist, somebody who looks after diabetes patients.
Oh, okay. Well, it's fascinating to me that you received training in homeopathy and in acupuncture. Is it true that your first employment as a doctor was in an institution that practiced homeopathy?
Yes. In fact, I grew up in Germany, and our family doctor was a homeopath, not just any homeopath, but quite a well-known homeopath in Germany. And he treated me homeopathically for all sorts of ailments. And when I studied medicine, I began to realize that homeopathy wasn't actually real medicine. Nevertheless, my first job was in the only homeopathic hospital in Germany at the time. I stayed only a few months, something like half a year, and it is there that I learned homeopathy, acupuncture, many other alternative treatments, hands-on, at the bedside, basically.
Yeah. So your conversion to allopathy or modern medicine was fairly gradual, or was there a steep change there?
Well, after that, I became a conventional physician, and one day I decided to leave clinical medicine altogether and go into basic research. And it was then that I began to think differently. Doctors, by and large, do not think critically at all, or not even scientifically.
Uh-huh.
In medical school, we are so busy taking in all this knowledge that we hardly can think at all, and certainly not critically. So anyway, when I became a scientist, and that was in London, the whole outlook changed, and I began to ask questions about what I had done previously about alternative medicine, not just about alternative medicine. And eventually I went back into clinical medicine, became a professor of rehabilitation medicine. I was appointed at a large department in Vienna, Austria. And one day I saw advertised in the New Scientist a post to create a chair in complementary medicine at Exeter. I applied, I got it, and the rest is history.
Well, yeah, if there's anyone who knows both sides of this whole question, that would be you. Okay, well, let's now hear your advice on how to become a charlatan. while our international audience, go ahead and type your questions and we'll field them at the end of the talk. Dr. Ernst, bitte.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm going to turn you all into pseudoscientists within the next 45 minutes, if I can. Let's see. Can I have a next slide? This is just repeating what we just have been talking about, my personal history. And I don't need to go into that in much detail. I became, as I just said, chair in complementary medicine at Exeter University. I built up a team of about 20 researchers, and that's quite important. The department was not a clinical department. Our remit was to do research and nothing else. So we didn't see patients other than when doing clinical trials. And we published a lot. We did clinical trials, systematic reviews, and other types of research. I received lots of awards, and eventually I retired. And that is quite an interesting story in itself, because Prince Charles was instrumental in making me retire, but that's a different lecture altogether. Today, I enjoy life. I live in Cambridge, England, and in Brittany, in France, about half-half. I give lectures like today. I write books, and I run a blog, which I recommend you visit. It's a very lively place, and there you can find about 2,500. I'm not kidding, 2,500 articles. What I do usually is, when something new is published in my field, alternative medicine, I write it up and criticize the science. That's basically what it is. Next slide. And during the last 30 years, you can imagine, I came across more pseudoscientists than I care to remember, and hence the subject of today's talk. Next slide. I better define what a pseudoscientist is. That's quite simple. It's a person who engages in pseudoscience, which begs the question, what is pseudoscience? And I'm sure you know it. If not, let me spell it out again. It's a belief or practice which is falsely presented as scientific while lacking the validity, plausibility, reliability, or status of science. Okay, that's pretty clear. Next one. Why would you want to become a pseudoscientist? Well, that's also pretty clear to me, at least. There's a great demand for it. It's good money, very good money in some cases. If you think of Deepak Chopra, for instance, you can even get famous. You can make the title page of Newsweek magazine, etc. And I bet it's great fun. I bet Deepak Chopra and Andrew Weil laugh their heads off when they see that consumers believe them. And it's not very demanding. You don't need to be the brightest button in the drawer to be a pseudoscientist. So therefore, I think you should consider this as a career. Next slide. And I'm going to give you 9 lessons for beginners how to do it. First lesson, you have to invent or adopt a bizarre theory or treatment. Next slide. There are plenty of options, of course. Here we have the old Himalayan cure for constipation. Here we have the Tabasco cure for dry eye disease. And here we have something interesting that I'm going to repeatedly come back to during my lecture. It is a treatment where you can use X-ray, you can use a duck, you can use a cell phone, you can use the pus coming out of a gonorrheic penis, or you can use the Berlin Wall. I'm talking, of course, of homeopathy. Here we have again the X-ray remedy, we have the duck remedy, we have the cell phone remedy, we have the penis. That's the wrong slide. The next one, the remedy made of the pus from the penis, and a remedy made from Berlin Wall. People think that homeopathy has something to do with herbal medicine. It hasn't. Firstly, it can use plants as its basis, but it can use any other material as well, as you can see here. And secondly, it really doesn't use these substances, but it dilutes them and so much that eventually there's nothing left. Next slide. This is the guy who invented homeopathy some 200 years ago, Samuel Hahnemann, a German physician, just like I am. And he postulated that like cures like, and less is more. And I'm going to show you that in the next slides. What it means, like cures like, is the main principle of homeopathy, and it sounds very complicated, but in fact it's quite simple. If I, as a homeopath, see a patient who suffers from runny eyes, runny nose, like for instance with hay fever, I'm likely to give him a remedy based on onions, simply because onions make eyes water. Like cures like. It's that simple. Another example is a person who cannot sleep, suffers from insomnia. I would give that person a remedy made of coffee, simply because coffee prevents us falling asleep. Next one. And as I said, homeopaths don't administer the onion undiluted, but they dilute and dilute and dilute quite endlessly. On this graph, I've shown you what happens to the concentration of the onion or the coffee or whatever. It very quickly goes down, even with C1, C2, C3, C4 to zero, or approaches zero. In fact, after a C12, the likelihood that a single molecule of the starting substance is contained in the remedy approach is zero. And I should mention that the most common dilution, homeopaths speak of potencies. The most common potency is a C30, which means less than one molecule per universe of the onion or coffee or whatever. So, next slide. Enough about the theory of homeopathy. I'm sure you knew that anyway. The big question is, does homeopathy work? And in the next slide, you can see the results of a clinical trial that we did when I was working at Exeter. It was a trial of individualized homeopathy. Homeopaths like to individualize their treatment, meaning that the characteristics of the patient and not the diagnosis of the patient determines what remedy he or she gets. And it was for treating childhood asthma, asthma because homeopaths claim that asthma can be treated very well with homeopathy, and kids, we chose kids because homeopaths claim that kids are particularly good responders. This was a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial, so the Rolls-Royce of clinical assessment was just under 100 kids, and they were treated either with homeopathy or placebo. Our main parameter for assessing the success of treatment was quality of life, and the results showed no effect whatsoever of homeopathy compared to placebo. Our conclusion: no evidence that adjunctive homeopathic remedies are superior to placebo. Next one. And you probably know about the hierarchy of evidence. A randomized clinical trial is, as I indicated, the on the top of the pyramid when it comes to experimental studies. But one such study can be wrong by coincidence or by cheating or by many other reasons, and therefore we need systematic reviews or meta-analysis to make sure that we are not falling victim of somebody who falsified their findings, for instance. Next slide. Systematic review is when you search for all the available data that is relevant to your research question. You then critically evaluate these data and you create an overall result. It's a meta-analysis if you create an overall statistical result by pooling the data from the. So having explained that, next slide. I'll show you a systematic review that I published, homeopathy for eczema. We found 3 trials. All of them were of quite weak methodology, and none of them demonstrated the efficacy of homeopathy. Our conclusion was the evidence from controlled clinical trial fails to show that homeopathy is an efficacious treatment for eczema. Next slide. But homeopaths say, okay, this was done by this nasty chap, Edzard Ernst, who produces nothing but negative results, and there are plenty more systematic reviews and clinical trials, of course, who seem to indicate the opposite, who that show, in other words, that homeopathy is effective. So let's look at the next slide. Because we have so many systematic reviews, I had the rather bizarre idea one day to do a systematic review of systematic reviews. And that was published 20 years ago already in the British Journal of Clinical Pharmacology. And the conclusion was that clinical evidence for homeopathy does not warrant positive recommendations for its use in clinical practice. In other words, it doesn't work. And next slide. Many years later, the National Health and Medical Research Council in Australia repeated that exercise. At that stage, they found 53 systematic reviews, and they pulled them all together and tried to make sense out of it in what essentially was a systematic review of systematic reviews. And here's their conclusion. the evidence does not show that homeopathy is effective. Homeopaths across the world were incensed by that, and tried to find faults in that analysis. But I think the analysis is correct. As a pseudoscientist, you must be very irritated as well by that, particularly if you want to be a pseudoscientist in homeopathy. I would say, however, never mind, you're not interested in science. Next slide. You're interested in, gosh, what is that? There's a slide missing. Never mind. There's one missing. You're interested in abusing science, which is my second lesson. Do not rely on science. Do abuse science, and for that there are plenty of methods, and I'm going to introduce just 2 examples. Next slide. This is probably the study that homeopaths like best and cite quite often. It was conducted in Bristol, not a million miles away from Exeter, on a very large sample of patients, 6,500, and they were treated with homeopathy, and the results show that 71% of these patients reported positive effects after being treated with homeopathy. The authors concluded that homeopathic treatment is a valuable intervention. This is what pleases homeopaths. Articles like this, but you need to know that this was an observational study. It had no control group whatsoever, so we don't know at all whether it was a placebo effect, a regression towards the mean, or whatever. And you don't know from that slide that homeopathy wasn't the only treatment. They got all other treatments on the planet if necessary. So we really don't know whether it was the homeopathic treatment or some other remedies or therapies that they received. And the conclusion, homeopathic treatment is a valuable intervention, is quite simply unwarranted. And this happens so often that I think there's method in this madness, and that as a scientist, as a pseudoscientist, you just simply need to draw the wrong conclusions from what seems to be quite a decent, interesting study, and you conclude invariably that your treatment was effective, never mind what the study actually shows. Next slide. But this is obvious, isn't it? And it's called cheating on a very large scale, and you're bound to be found out if you do that. Therefore, you need something much more subtle. Next slide. And here's an example for that. This is a study from Michael Fraß in Vienna, professor in Vienna, recently retired. And its aim was to evaluate whether homeopathy influenced the outcomes of cancer patients. Would you believe it? And it was a randomized clinical trial, so exactly what I just called the Rolls-Royce of clinical investigation on a large group of cancer patients who received either homeopathy with standard care or standard care alone. And the results show that patients improved significantly when they were treated with homeopathy. So that is not quite so easy to find out where this trial and the conclusion is wrong. The next slide tries to explain to you. The people in this slide got A plus B, and that was compared to B. A plus B is always more than B if you compare it in monetary terms, for instance. They got homeopathy plus standard care compared to standard care alone. And this is incredibly popular, that sort of trial design, and it's popular because it has the extremely welcome effect that it cannot possibly ever produce a negative result. So that is much more elegant cheating, and I recommend that you do that when you do your pseudoscientific research. Next slide. Lesson number 3, avoid facts and use fallacy wherever you can. Next slide. And there are plenty of fallacies to choose from. I'm giving you 4 examples, 4 popular examples in alternative medicine. Next slide. The appeal to popularity. You argue something like this: millions of patients use my treatment, for instance, homeopathy, and most are satisfied with it. They even pay out of their own pocket for it, and therefore homeopathy must be good. That is proof of millions of patients, much more weighty, much more valuable than proof by the scientific methods like a clinical trial. Next slide. The appeal to tradition. You say my treatment is hundreds or thousands of years old. If it isn't, you just invent an old history and claim it is thousands years old. This will convince consumers that is good. Something that has stood the test of time must be good. Never mind that the fact that a treatment is very old means it was developed when the understanding of human physiology was extremely incomplete, and therefore the long tradition really means that the treatment is obsolete. Next slide. Appeal to authority. Highly regarded individuals, organization, etc. use it, and therefore it must be good. Next slide shows you some of these personalities. I start with Dr. Oz, who doesn't need an explanation to an American audience. Under Oz, there's Usain Bolt, who promotes homeopathy. Then we have Prince Charles. We're coming back to him again during my talk. He promotes all sorts of quackery. Olivia Newton-John allegedly cured her breast cancer with alternative medicine, except it came back. Arnie Schwarzenegger is a fan of chiropractic. Luc Montagnier promoted homeopathy. He's the Nobel Prize, one of the 2 Nobel Prize winners for discovering the AIDS virus. And later on, he decided to promote homeopathy. And the man in the middle is Linus Pauling, who got 2 Nobel Prizes, and then discovered high-dose vitamin C, which he promoted, amongst other things, against cancer, and eventually died of cancer. Next slide. The 4th fallacy is the appeal to nature. You just claim your treatment is natural, and what is natural has to be harmless. People believe that, never mind that it's obviously not true at all. Next slide. Here we have some data about adverse effects of various alternative treatments. And when we published that, it was so sensational that even the highly reputed Journal of Nature published our humble survey, where we found that about 16% of people receiving spinal manipulation have adverse effects, 12% of people having acupuncture have adverse effects, etc., etc. Today, and this is the middle column, we know that these figures were by and large underestimates. 50% of people suffer adverse effects of spinal manipulation, and there are well over 100 deaths being reported in the literature after spinal manipulation. Next slide. And here is a systematic review of deaths after acupuncture that I published. And in that systematic review, I found 86 deaths after acupuncture. And of course, as a pseudoscientist, you must claim this is very, very little, considering how old acupuncture is and how often it is administered every single day. But next slide. You need to remember that the 86 deaths are quite clearly the tip of a much larger iceberg. And this is because we have no post-marketing surveillance of adverse effects in alternative medicine. In conventional medicine, adverse effects are monitored. In alternative medicine, they're not monitored, and therefore we only have the occasional write-ups in the medical literature, which are few and clearly do not reflect the full picture. Next slide. And the dangers of alternative medicine extend also to indirect dangers. Not necessarily the treatment itself is dangerous, but the context in which the treatment is being administered, or the advice of the medical practitioner, or charlatan rather, that prescribes alternative medicine. This has been shown by this American study of cancer patients. Basically, it shows that 5-year survival was reduced by 50%, if people also used alternative medicine, simply because then they tend to take conventional treatments less seriously, and that obviously must have detrimental effects. The indirect effects, next slide, the indirect effects of alternative medicine are difficult to research, and the only area where we know a little bit more, other than the occasional study, is when it comes to vaccination. Next slide. Next. We know that alternative practitioners advise against vaccination, and this leads me to conclude, if used as an alternative for an effective treatment, even a harmless therapy can become life-threatening. Lesson number 4. Make as many bogus claims as you can get away with. That's pretty obvious. Next one. I give you 4 examples. Next. 3 examples. Sorry. Chiropractors. One tends to think that they treat sore backs, but that is simply not true. They treat colic, they treat earache, asthma, allergies, sleep problems, bedwetting of children, and that is just children. Basically, they treat every ailment under the planet, and the inventor of chiropractic didn't even, when he invented it, think it was a cure for backache. He thought it was a really true cure-all, a panacea. Next slide. Example of acupuncture. Traditional Chinese acupuncturists believe that acupuncture treats the imbalance of yin and yang, and that restores health and gives you a disease-free life. Beautiful, isn't it? Next. And here we are back with Prince Charles, who several years ago marketed via his dodgy company. He marketed a detox tincture. A detox tincture, and bearing in mind that a detox is nonsense anyway, and a tincture to detox is double nonsense. Prince Charles is going to come back in a minute. Next slide, please. And lesson number 5, perfect your cherry picking skills. Next slide. Cherry picking is the art of supporting your pseudoscience with conclusions, and exclusively conclusions that support your pseudoscience. So next slide. Perversely, this can be even done with systematic reviews, which I would call pseudo-systematic reviews. Schematically demonstrated here. With almost any form of treatment, you have positive results and you have negative results. That is entirely normal. And you can do a pseudo-systematic review by fishing out those trials that are positive, and you then do a review of those trials and you come to a positive conclusion, thus misleading everybody who ever reads your paper. Next slide. And this happens in real life, in real life of pseudoscience. Next slide. Spine is one of the best journals when it comes to low back pain and related problems. And they published a review of acupuncture for chronic back pain, including 25 RCTs, and concluding that acupuncture may have favorable effects on self-reported pain and functional limitations. That sounded very positive for acupuncturists, but unfortunately, we found that the largest trial with over 1,000 patients was not included, was discreetly forgotten in this systematic review. If the authors had included it, the results would have been negative. So this is a pseudo-scientific, pseudo-systematic review. The next slide shows you another one. This is a famous one on homeopathy. Randomized placebo-controlled trials of individualized homeopathy, a systematic review. It included 32 randomized clinical trials, and the conclusion: medicines prescribed in individualized homeopathy may have small specific treatment effects. That is puzzling, knowing that homeopathy is pure placebo. but it gets less puzzling if we know that the two best quality trials were excluded. Both of these trials were negative, and if they had been included, the overall result would have been negative. Next slide. Lesson number 6. You have to claim as a pseudoscientist that your treatment, whatever treatment you have found, is a panacea, a cure-all. Next slide. And the way to do that is to claim that your treatment treats the root causes of all diseases. Acupuncture do it, as I just mentioned, by saying acupuncture restores the balance of the two life forces which govern our health. And by restoring them, you restore health. Homeopathy is based on the vital energy. The vital energy is being restored by the homeopathic remedy, and therefore health is being restored. I've mentioned D.D. Palmer, who invented chiropractic, and he said that subluxations are the cause of 95% of all human illness. Therefore, adjusting subluxations, in other words, manipulating the spine, will cure practically all diseases that mankind suffers from. Next slide. And of course, let's not forget homeopathy. Homeopathy is not just a first aid treatment as depicted on this photograph, but I defy you to find a condition for which homeopathy is not claimed to be effective by homeopaths. It virtually treats any disease, a cure-all. Next slide. Lesson number 7. You must, of course, get rich, and in order to get rich, you must charge lots of money. Next slide shows you some examples. Here we have somebody doing healing via the telephone, and you can see the eye-watering fees that this person charges for the telephone service of energy healing. Next slide. Even much more expensive, one order of magnitude more expensive, is this little device that keeps you protected from electromagnetic fields. Next slide. And this is somebody you know probably quite well. If you lack sexual desire, arousal, etc., you can buy Gwyneth Paltrow's little remedies for $55 per bottle. Next slide. Lesson number 8. Of course, you have to be economical with the truth. Next slide. And here I have only one example. Veleda is in Europe quite a famous firm. It was founded by Rudolf Steiner and his mistress, Ita Wegmann. And they produce anthroposophical remedies and homeopathic remedies. Recently, they had their 100th birthday, and for that they had a little celebration. And on the website, they published 4 statements, which I've copied here. Homeopathy works by stimulating the body's own natural healing capacity. Today, there are 4 homeopathic hospitals offering treatment in the UK. There still is, it's still the only alternative medicine incorporated in the NHS, National Health Service. And active elements are in infinitesimal small quantities in homeopathic remedies. Next slide. I have corrected these statements so that they're factually correct. Homeopathy does not work. Today there are 0 homeopathic hospitals in the NHS. There is no longer any material incorporated in the active, so-called active homeopathic remedy, and there is no longer any homeopathy available on the NHS. So if the firm Velida can be economical with the truth, surely you as a pseudoscientist can do the same. Next slide. And this is my last lesson for the aspiring pseudoscientists. When found out, and you're likely to be found out at one stage by these nasty skeptics, you go on the attack. Next slide. Next slide. This is somebody you might know, my friend Simon Singh. We together published a book, Trick or Treatment, about 10 years ago. And while advertising the book, he published an article in The Guardian where he claimed that the British Chiropractic Association has not a jot of evidence for some of their claims. He then got sued by them, and after a lengthy legal procedure, and lots of money, he won his case. So that is an example where a scientist stood up against pseudoscientists, namely chiropractors in the UK. A famous case, which is not only famous in terms of chiropractic and alternative medicine, but also because it changed libel law in the United Kingdom. Next slide. Personally, I've had plenty of attacks, aggressions. I had 2 legal actions in front of court. I needed legal help about 50 times in the last 30 years. I had about 10 official complaints via my university, which were most unpleasant, and one by Prince Charles cost me my job. And I have about 1 ad hominem attack per day via my blog. Next slide. This is Prince Charles for the last time. He claimed via his first private secretary that I had broken confidence, and I therefore had a 13 months investigation upon me, during which time my department fell apart, funding fell apart, no more money, etc., etc. I was eventually pronounced innocent by my university, but it was too late. The department basically didn't exist anymore, and I went into early retirement. So much to being sued by pseudoscientists. Next slide. The end is near, and I hope you have some questions prepared. Next slide. Becoming a pseudoscientist, I have shown, is easy. I've shown that it is lucrative, but I have also shown that it is irresponsible, and I have shown that it puts lives in danger. Next slide. And therefore, I hope that you have second thoughts. Next slide. I think, as far as scientists are concerned, we don't need to join them, we need to fight them. Next slide. And the last slide. Here are my conclusions. The fight against pseudoscience is endless. It cannot be won, but it must be fought in order to minimize harm. And the best antidote for pseudoscience is critical thinking. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Dr. Ernst. I have one question I can't thought of is, well, in general, are things getting better in Europe regarding the practice of pseudosciences, pseudomedicine?
Well, I'm not so sure. We have won some battles. For instance, homeopathy is no longer available via the NHS. That is a victory. There are no NHS hospitals in the UK anymore, and we used to have 5 of them. So there's some victories, but there's also much of the opposite. As I said, this is a battle that cannot be won. We can only try to minimize harm.
Okay, well, also you mentioned that A plus B is always better than B alone. Is that generally because the placebo effect would come into an A plus B?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I used the symbols of two packs of money plus a few coins, and the pack of money plus a few coins is always more than the pack of paper money, and the few coins was less. The placebo effect usually is not very prominent, but it's nevertheless more than nothing, and therefore A plus B. Even if you test a placebo with that type of trial design, you will get a positive result, implying that the placebo is actually an effective treatment. That's the whole point. That's the whole point of the A plus B design, and this is why it is so incredibly popular in alternative medicine. You find hundreds of these trials, and they convince people who don't look through that type of design. They certainly convince non-medical, non-scientific decision makers like politicians.
Okay, questions from the audience? What have we here? What is your take on osteopathy?
Well, it's complicated, osteopathy. This is why I avoid talking about it. In America, the osteopaths have come to an arrangement a long time ago with the medics, and they are basically medics by another name. They have studied medicine. They can become surgeons, neurologists, etc., etc. Anywhere else, they're quacks. So even in Canada, I understand they are complementary practitioners. In other words, quacks. Certainly in the UK, they are. In Germany, they are. And the interesting thing is the complementary practitioners who practice osteopathy in Germany or in England claim that in America they are fully recognized, not pointing out that they're also fully studied medics, and that they are osteopaths only by name, and hardly ever use spinal manipulation or other manual techniques.
Yeah, a good friend of mine was a respected osteopath in Oregon. Are there any other questions? Linda Rosa asks, what was the politics behind ending homeopathy in the UK, the National Health Service?
It took a very long time. First of all, one has to perhaps address the question, why did it ever enter the National Health Service? And apparently that was because of royal protection. The British royal family have been fond of homeopathy for many generations. So in 1948, when the NHS was created, it was the only alternative treatment that was considered to be inside the National Health Service. And then nasty people like me came up with negative evidence and pointed out that there is no good evidence. Then even more nasty people like I pointed out that it does a lot of harm by basically by neglect. If you treat a cancer with homeopathy, you basically hasten the death of the patient. So then it needed quite some lobbying to get this through to politicians, the lack of evidence. And for that, we have an organization which was created by Simon Singh, who I showed in one of the slides. And it's called the Good Thinking Society, and they lobbied heavily. And eventually the message got through to decision makers of the NHS, and eventually they took it from the list of reimbursable remedies.
Okay, have we time for another? Oh, we have another question here. Trick or Treatment is an amazing book. Do you have more plans to work with Simon Singh?
Yes, but he doesn't. we are good. We are very good friends, and we are in contact. And he has written another amazing book on mathematics about in The Simpsons. Apparently, in these plots by The Simpsons, there's lots of mathematics hidden away, and he discloses that, and it's a very good book. But you need to be switched on to understand it. And I often asked him whether he wants to do a book. In fact, I recently published a book about Prince Charles, Charles the Alternative Prince, it's called. And I pleaded with Simon to come on as a co-author, but he said he's not interested. He has 2 boys, and he's very much more into mathematics these days than into alternative medicine.
Uh-huh. Okay, have we other questions, or are we ready to wrap up here? It looks like we're ready to wrap up. Again, thank you. I appreciate this. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did as well. So we give you a round of applause.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was fun.